Well, good morning everyone, and it's great to see so many of you turning out today on what is yet another balmy and sunny, welcoming Sydney morning. That's a bit of sarcasm that's been going on for the last 2 days with some of our overseas visitors, so I'm sorry not to share the rest of the story with you. But firstly, I'd like to follow on from Uncle Ray's welcome to country, and I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal and the Wongal people of the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today here in Darling Harbour. And it's not often that we can acknowledge two Indigenous nations in this way, but Darling Harbour, or Tumbalong as it's known, forms a boundary point between these two clans. And it's perhaps for this reason that it has a history of being a place of meeting and celebration that far precedes European settlement. It's apt that Darling Harbour continues that role today as Sydney's meeting place with the world. And it's with great pleasure that I welcome you all to the Data Privacy Asia Pacific Conference. I especially thank those who have travelled some great distances to be here to contribute with our discussions today. Today is an opportunity to explore both the innovations that can be enabled by data and strategies needed to address the challenge this poses to personal data protection. These concepts, data innovation and personal data protection, are deeply interdependent. Without assurance of personal data protection, innovation in data-based products and services struggle to gain user trust, a commodity of vital importance in both public and private sectors. And the value of today's event comes from the variety of presenters representing both the public and private sector perspectives on these issues. We have the voices of regulators responsible for defining data protection obligations, as well as the organisations working to develop new ways of utilising data while meeting expectations of personal data protection. They join representatives from academia, the legal sector, prominent think tanks, professional services and technology groups to provide a range of perspectives on the different working parts of personal data protection. We welcome contributors from across the world, including those from New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong, Canada and the United States and the United Kingdom. Their discussions today will provide valuable insight into the global data protection regulatory environment and what may be expected in the future of data governance. We're also joined by our fellow colleagues from the Asia Pacific Privacy Authorities who have been attending the 47th meeting of that forum over the last 2 days here. So apart from those countries mentioned, we also have representatives in the room from Mexico, Macau, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, as well as my colleagues from the states and territories here in Australia. Our plenary sessions and the 3 breakout work streams provide opportunities for knowledge sharing between industry and regulators. The subject matter framing the presentations and panel discussions today are wide-ranging. There's an opportunity to learn about data breach resilient organisational structures, the benefits and challenges of nascent technologies and digital health initiatives, among other subjects. Such is the complexity of privacy and data in 2017. And I think I can be safe to say that if I look back to the privacy regulators who met in Australia during 1992, one of the first meetings of a group of regulators in this region, to discuss privacy regulation matters and the need to collaborate on them, they would not have imagined their meetings to transform into an event like this 25 years later. That meeting, the National Privacy Agencies Conference, evolved into the Asia Pacific Privacy Authorities Forum, or APA, which includes member nations now numbering 19 across the Asia Pacific area. APA is now the principal forum for privacy authorities in our region, with a focus on building strong and long-lasting work relationships between jurisdictions that face very similar privacy challenges. This official APA conference is another step forward in international collaboration in personal data protection by providing a platform for discussions between these regulatory jurisdictions and businesses. After all, the challenges faced by both the public and private sectors in personal data protection are very similar indeed. Identifying and implementing the processes and systems that safeguard data to the highest possible standard will be a continual challenge as new technologies are created and spread through our communities. Community expectations in personal data protection and the use of data will also continue to change over time. For example, the Australian community are reputable early adopters of new technologies, from wearable fitness trackers to augmented reality apps. But we also know from my office's long-running Community Attitudes to Privacy survey that privacy concerns are held by the majority of Australians, concerns which drive expectations on how personal data should be used by organisations and individuals purchasing decisions. The 2017 Australian Community Attitudes to Privacy survey found that 58% of Australians have avoided a business because of concerns about how that business would handle their personal information. And this reflects the 60% finding we had in the 2013 survey, so there is consistency there. 44% of people had decided not to download a mobile app for the same reasons. These figures have remained pretty consistent over the past community surveys. However, we also saw the potential for broad public support for personal information being used in projects that benefit the public. A new question specifically tested the idea of personal information being used by government for research, service development, or policy development purposes. Without background information on the potential outcomes of these projects, 46% of people said they were comfortable with their personal information being used for these purposes. However, a further 21% were neither comfortable or uncomfortable, and 19% were only somewhat uncomfortable, which suggests that 40% of Australians have not formed a hard view on this idea as yet. These figures are a marked contrast from the baseline figure for people who believe secondary use of data is a misuse of that data, and that figure was 86% of respondents. And this suggests Australians are willing to consider data sharing and reuse of technologies, but only when a case is made to demonstrate the public benefit in doing so. As I've said many times in the past, Australians are, by and large, very reasonable about new uses of personal data, so long as transparency is part of the bargain. And how apt the lights came up when transparency came on. Clearly communicated data protection processes and systems are the building blocks of consumer and community trust. Enabling individuals to make informed decisions. I'm all about open government here, really, I am. I have two arms to my world. I'll go back to that point. Enabling individuals to make informed decisions about their data and demonstrating that organisations take data protection seriously. In this way, personal data protection supports innovation, because when we talk about personal data protection, we are talking about privacy rights in the digital age and the need to ensure that personal identity and public benefit can be mutually achieved. Large data sets can be extraordinarily useful in telling us about a community or a consumer group, identifying gaps in the provision of services or products, and propelling research and informing better decision-making in both the private and the public sector. But this same data can reveal an individual's attitudes, behaviours and experiences. It can reveal personal, even damaging information in the wrong context. And there is no irony in the fact that often the most personal information is the richest in its potential for public data use. The misuse of this information can potentially cause serious harm, affecting someone's finances, their mental and emotional well-being, their relationships, or even their physical security. Indeed, there is the potential for reused or merged data to create new information about a person, even inadvertently, potentially without the individual even being aware of it. And so, in addition to robust data protection processes and systems, there is an ongoing need for this rights-based regulation that governs the use of data to provide assurance to individuals that their privacy is prioritised, and so that organisations and government agencies' obligations are very clear. Simply put, a successful data-driven economy needs a strong foundation in privacy. This approach has been exemplified recently in Australia with two initiatives I will briefly touch on. The first is the development of a binding privacy governance code for the Australian Public Service. This code acts under the auspices of the Privacy Act to make explicit the requirements of all Commonwealth government agencies that are bound by the Act in terms of meeting their obligations under Australian Privacy Principle 1.2. The purpose of creating this code stems from my view that the Australian government should be seen as the national leader in terms of trusted personal information practices. Through the code, we are creating a single high standard of personal information governance that will apply to personal information no matter where it travels within the public service. We are making best practice the only practice for Australian public service agencies. And because this standard will apply across all agencies, it provides an essential assurance to communities in terms of data sharing, which is necessary to build public confidence in the government's data and innovation agenda. The second initiative is the establishment of a mandatory data breach reporting scheme, or as we've termed it here in Australia, a notifiable data breaches scheme. The NDB scheme, which comes into effect in February 2018, requires businesses and agencies with existing obligations under the Privacy Act to notify individuals whose personal information is involved in a data breach that is likely to result in serious harm. There is also the requirement to report to my office. The term serious harm is a qualification introduced to avoid overburdening organisations with the cost of compliance and to reduce the likelihood of notification fatigue for individuals. In short, not every data breach is an eligible data breach. The NDB scheme requires organisations to evaluate the impact of a data breach in context using a reasonable person test. In doing so, it establishes a framework supporting transparency in data protection that can be carried forward. For many of you, the requirements of the NDB scheme will be familiar. Jurisdictions in the United Kingdom, Canada, Korea, Mexico and the United States have introduced mandatory data breach reporting schemes. The new European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, which we'll be discussing today, also carries a similar requirement for the notification of particular data breaches. The reach of these schemes, which can place obligations on multinational organisations, underscores the vital importance of interoperability, the theme of the APA Forum this year. Interoperable regulation that can be effectively and readily applied across different jurisdictions makes compliance easier for businesses. It also means international cooperation is simpler as regulators can readily coordinate their efforts. I know that Australia's ability to cooperate rapidly with fellow APA members in the instance of a multinational data breach has been of great value in enforcing Australian consumer privacy rights. And I'm confident we'll hear more examples of that during the afternoon plenary sessions with our visiting regulators. Finally, today's agenda is one that not only speaks to Australian privacy, but to Australian innovation and trade. In the post-settlement era, Tumbalong became known as Darling Harbour and rapidly became the primary shipping point for exports from the colony of New South Wales. It was Sydney's exchange point with the world. That focus on exchange of services, knowledge, ideas and technical capital continues as a primary characteristic of Australian business to this day. Our businesses and consumers exist in a global data environment, So strong and efficient data protection must be approached with a global perspective. Interoperability and the sharing of knowledge between industries at the forefront of innovations and regulators at the forefront of governance will be key to this. With that in mind, I do hope that you enjoy the presentations and the discussions today, and as Virginia says, please participate. It'll be more value to you all then. Thank you very much.